Namaste and welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I'm joined by a special guest, Rishabh Kumar, Assistant Professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and also a fellow JNUite. Rishabh, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Abhinav. It's a pleasure to be here.
Rishabh, these days we see the debate on inequality is again coming back at the center stage of economic discussion. So, before we start discussing the inequality trends in India, why don't you tell us what do you mean by inequality when you talk about it in economic literature, and why is inequality important? Because some people might say, how does it matter? If everyone has access to basic necessity, how does inequality matter at all?
Yeah. So inequality really is the study of polarization of resources within society, and it's very different. It's a very different topic from poverty, which is really looking at the standard of living at the extreme lower end of the population. Inequality really is about how rich the rich are and how the rest of the economy is relative to the rich classes. So it really, in the modern literature, it's really about the top 1% and the top 10%. What is their share of income? What is their share of wealth? How has it evolved in the long run? Is it correlated with certain macroeconomic phenomena? Like, does it increase when growth goes up? Does it decrease when growth goes up? So those are kind of the important aspects, and that's how we kind of define inequality. That's the field of inequality studies. In terms of why it's important, there's a few reasons. First is, yes, if your society is already highly advanced in terms of its living standards, so you take the case of the Scandinavian countries, if inequality goes up there a little bit or even goes up over a sustained period, it probably won't have that much of an impact because the core issue from a democratic sense has been resolved. That is, everyone has access to public goods, everyone has access to some basic standard of living, which is quite high relative to the population. In countries which don't have a strong welfare state, so you take an advanced economy like the United States, where the welfare state till recently was not as robust as it is in Scandinavia, here inequality is a major issue because the rich are so rich that they exercise a lot of control on democratic politics, and then they also have an impact on the macroeconomic variables in the economy. So, for example, if you have extremely rich people who are hoarding all the income and they are not likely to spend most of it, they're likely to invest maybe make savings out of it instead of using it for driving consumption spending. You might not be collecting the target revenues because they have access to excellent investment management, which can transfer their assets abroad. Those kinds of issues. For a country like India, it's a very different thing because in India, of course, it does not have the state capacity to be a welfare state yet. But at the standard of living that it's at, inequality basically becomes entangled with the question of poverty, which is that most of the population is well below the standard of living in middle income countries, and a little bit of the population is rich. Some people within that segment of the rich are extremely rich. You can compare them to people in the rest of the world, but that's not the case for even most of the upper middle class in India. Most of the upper middle class is at best middle income in comparison to the rest of the world. So, if you think about it on a global sense, the GDP per person in the world right now is about $18,000 in terms of purchasing power parity, adjusting for cost of living in different countries. And in India, this figure is about $7,000 purchasing power parity. So India is well below the world's median middle income standard. So that's really the issue. That is there any standard of living? Have we distributed or diffused tolerable standard of living across the population? And right now, obviously, the answer is no. India is still, most people in India are quite poor by global standards.
True. Even the size of middle class is much smaller than what is claimed in the official statistics.
But yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But when we talk about inequality, so give us a historical sense of inequality in India. Let's say, especially from the 1947, but before that as well. What has been the pattern and the trend of inequality in India? What are the variables which have affected it?
Okay. So let me talk about income inequality, because for this we have comparatively good data. I wouldn't say good data, but we have data to begin with. And then there's adjustments that we make on it. But according to the literature, which tracks this variable over the long run, inequality was quite high during the colonial period. It actually increased during the interwar period between the First and the Second World War, because of the Great Depression, but also because of stagnation within the economy. So most people saw that most of the population basically saw their income stagnate, and some income went up to the elites, the domestic elites, the indigenous capitalists, and the indigenous princely class, landlord class, etc. Now, the important thing to remember here is this was happening at a period where there was almost no growth. So the interwar period, the per capita income growth in India in real terms was zero. This began to decline after independence. And one of the main reasons is that there was a little bit of growth. So it's well known that 1950 to 1980, there was very little growth in India, compared to East Asia, but it was still better than 0%. So even 1%, 1.2% per person is better than 0%. And obviously, this has to do with the development model that was adopted at that point, but it didn't generate a lot of growth. It did generate some growth with all the constraints that are well known. So that basically what it did is it did not really emancipate the population, but it did raise the levels at the bottom a little bit. And the other thing that happened is that they were able to cap off and expropriate a lot of resources from the top. So they were able to take a lot of income from the top. So the trend is basically, if you look at India in the long run over the 20th century, it's a U shape. It's high to begin with at the dawn of independence. It goes down during the mixed economy period. And then it began to rise in the 1980s. So really with the literature traces this to the rise of, the emergence of Rajiv Gandhi and Indira Gandhi in the 1980s. During that period is when it starts to rise, but then it really begins to rise in the 1990s. We don't know anything exactly about what happened in the 2000s, because data was not published by the tax authorities during 2000 to 2010. And then the most recent estimates of income inequality around 2012, 2013 pointed to be increasing again. So it's basically almost back to the level it was during the interwar period. About 22%, 23% of national income goes to the top 1% at this point. And I think the important thing to say here is, this is all that the data can tell you. So, you have these reports that come out every year, Oxfam and Credit Suisse and all these banks. No one knows where they're getting this data from. This data is impossible to get, but we just don't know exactly what is happening since then, from 2011, 2012. We don't exactly know. It might have increased a lot more. It might have stayed the same. We don't know for sure.
Yeah. But you just made a very interesting point that inequality was rising under Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, which is supposedly, at least the Indira Gandhi rule is supposed to be the left-wing dominance in the economic policy. And Rajiv Gandhi is always credited with welfareism. What was happening in that decade that you see the rise of inequality?
Well, so Danny Roderick and Arvind Subramaniam have a famous paper which talks about India's growth since the 1980s. It's basically about how India exited the Hindu rate of growth period, basically. So it's not exactly the fact that, it's not like Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi came and they said, okay, I will now increase inequality. But really what happened is, in that period, Indira Gandhi came to power. So their hypothesis is that Indira Gandhi came to power on a pro-business rhetoric. Like, the election was won on a pro-business rhetoric. And she kind of let go of her past caricature as, a left-wing politician, and she aligned more with the business class, the domestic business class in the 1980s. And because of that alignment between the state and capital, you have some economic growth. Now, in a poor country, the development model, the standard development and growth model suggests that when you start economic growth indigenously, you bootstrap it on your own capital, there will be a rise in inequality automatically, because those who own the resources will get the first set of returns. And so that's basically how it was, that's basically the process that was kind of driving this. Now, what happens in 1990 onwards is that it mutates from a domestic capitalist model. India kind of aligns itself more with globalization, enters a global market. And at that point, the returns for the highly educated, the most resourced people, the wealthiest people, who can afford good education or who can capitalize on the global market, for them, the returns increased. And so the hypothesis is that caused inequality rise in the 1990s as well, and more than it did in the 1980s. But really, the break point in modern economic history is the 1980s, and it's this return of the Congress Party as a more pro-business party as opposed to a pro-people party, which it was prior to this.
Yeah, exactly. When Indira Gandhi returned to power, in the party which was torn, she was greeting people with Dhirubhai Ambani standing next to her, right? So this is, as you said, the alliance between the state and the capital, that came up front rather than remaining in the backdrop.
But she is historic. Sorry to I just wanted to add, like, she's a very anomalous character historically. A lot of the wealth leveling at the top also happened in her first. So every time she has kind of taken power, it's been through kind of this radical shock to the elites. Either it's pro-elite or it's anti-elite. Because when she first came to, this is right after she took power, and she had to align herself to the left wing. At that stage, she also enacted many policies which ended up reducing the wealth of the rich, like the absolute rich. This has to do with, for example, the privy purse that she passed with a lot of legislative havoc. But that actually had a fairly deep impact, because this princely class had kind of been sitting with this wealth since the end of the British term, and by kind of making them common citizens, she was able to, take some hereditary power that they held. Tax policy in that era is seen as confiscatory, expropriatory. It was pointless to be an entrepreneur because she would take away everything. The government would take away everything from high wealth and income taxes. But in all economies, there has been this moment where, there is this shock to the elite, some major shock to the elite, some kind of radical shock to the elite, whether it was the wars in Europe or it was, the post-war reconstruction in the United States. In India, obviously, this is not the case. India is a poor country. At this point, it's a very poor country. But, it was an interesting political moment. So it's very interesting that she herself has done both facets of this kind of policy.
Yeah. But, when we talk about India, we also have this problem of social stratification, especially the caste, right? That's one of the major factor. What's the status of the inequality based on your social background in India? Because from what I think, Rishabh, that after independence, the kind of economic model we followed, which was very top heavy, that you are opening up industries, factories, but not investing in the primary education and the thing, what happened that the inter-caste inequality actually increased. Let's say in an upper caste from a village moved to the urban center, to the modern sector, whereas the people from the backward caste or the lower caste, they remain where they are. So does that show up in the data or not?
I didn't catch that.
The thing is that, so I haven't looked very deeply into the caste aspect myself. Like, I would not be an expert on caste inequality. I know it's very high, and I've read some papers which suggest that you can definitely predict wealth inequality based on caste. So obviously in India, like, the upper castes have a lot of wealth. This also has to do with the rural-urban patterns. Rural India has stagnated and is comparatively more equal, but it's equal. I wouldn't say it's equal in a great sense, but there's less inequality there, but it's a stagnant level. And on the other hand, you have urban India, which is growing fast, but has high inequality. And so that kind of, it has a socioeconomic impact. And obviously, you can predict a lot of this by caste. But you're right, absolutely. Primary education was not emphasized early on. It was very top heavy. And that's why we've ended up with a kind of lopsided model at this point. But I would not, various governments have come and gone. All kinds of governments, left wing, right wing, sometimes within the same party. And every party does have some kind of pro-people aspect to them. You cannot survive in India under a democracy if you don't do some policy for this. But it's very difficult now to enact this kind of change. And the challenge we face really is in India is how do you emancipate such a large population with education? All these investments in education, quick enough to get results by the next election. That's almost impossible. So, short-term, long-term goals are very difficult to align in an economy like India.
Yeah, but let's say, do you think that the recent initiatives, especially after let's say the UPA 1, so UPA 1, UPA 2, and then NDA 3, and NDA 2 and NDA 3, that is the border terms of Modi government, the emphasis on welfare schemes, the emphasis on provision of private goods through public money, do you think that will have any impact on the inequality?
Yeah, it definitely will. And, one thing that's happened in the last, I would say, 9 years that we see in the data is that there is definitely, so the tax paying class has increased a little bit. It's very marginal. It's a few percent of the population, but it's increased. And you see a lot of growth in the lower end of the taxpayer distribution. So people who earn incomes between 1 and 10 lakhs, they are the group that have really increased in the tax-paying population. In terms of welfare schemes, I think we just don't have the data, because our last data on consumption ends in 2012. There hasn't been a new NSO report since then. The private sector is producing some data, but yesterday there was an article criticizing the CMIE data. This article by Drez and Sonmanchi says that they have a very tough focus bias. We don't know. We don't have the evidence yet, and we need to collect data, and there needs to be some systematic provision of data with which we can analyze something like this. We really do need to know this, and I think the last 10 years are a void. Last 9 years are a void in terms of data.
Yeah, I mean, that's a standard Indian problem. We just don't believe in documentation. Data is always a problem in India, right? That also brings to a different kind of a question. Many people say that India was pretty rich before the British rule and so on. And it's a golden picture of India. Do you think that was true? Because I think India was not rich even before the British came to and conquered India. I'm pretty sure there's no data available. But what does the literature say, or let's say what may be the anecdotal evidences of poverty in India, inequality in India before the colonial period?
Yeah. Well, so the view of India being rich and then having diverged from the rest of the world is really based on shares in global GDP. And these shares were estimated by Angus Madison. Now, the modern economic history literature has now begun putting doubts on whether he estimated GDP correctly. And what he may have just done is assume a certain per capita income. And on the basis of population, he computed shares of GDP by country. So China and India ended up having a fairly high share of global GDP. These numbers are not very well known. And in India, there's almost no data that systematically can show you what happened before 1870. Now, given the environmental and ecological challenges, given the structure of the state, it's very hard to believe that India was a wealthy. I'm sure there were many wealthy Indians. There's a very good documentation by a British statistician about the total amount of gold that has been collected that was sitting in India, starting with the invasion of Alexander. So that's something I kind of digitized in one of my papers that's currently in progress. But obviously there was a lot of gold. It was in the hands of a few. And no matter who the ruler was, whichever state, whichever princely state they were in, whichever imperial state they were in, I'm sure they were wealthy. But I think we simply cannot say that India was a rich country before it became poor during the British and then is on a development path now. I think the more accurate, or what the data tells us is that, we just don't know before 1870. And environmental, ecological, and social conditions make it quite unlikely that India was rich. People basically were, what was the most consistent occupation in that period? You were part of an army, you're part of a military, or you were servicing the military. It's rarely has there been an imperial state where the military, where the military makes you rich in that sense, or the people who work in the military are necessarily rich as opposed to the people who run the military. So I don't know. I would say that this is a fairly inaccurate. I think it's an inaccurate perception, and the literature is now suggesting that it was probably not true. In fact, we were some of the wage estimates suggest that India had begun diverging well before British rule. Yeah.
But that's true. The prosperity, the high income we see is the byproduct of industrial revolution. So before that, it's not a very accurate picture to imagine. People are living in lots of plenty and prosperity. And, as you pointed out, India never had a big state or a high-end state. So the avenues of occupation in army administration were also very limited. India was always this feudalistic, network-oriented political system, never a high-end state like China or in certain states of certain places of Europe.
Yeah.
But Rishabh, let's focus on the post-economic reform period, because there's lots of criticism that post-economic reform period has seen lots of inequality, even though the prosperity is also increased. Do you think it's a trade-off which every economy has to make? Look at China. China has become extremely rich, but highly unequal. Do you think inequality per se in the post-reform period is a bad thing?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So there's one very systematic trend across the world, which is that since the 1980s, the income share of the top 1% has gone up in almost every major economy, large economy. So United States, China, India, Russia, all these countries have had an increase in inequality, slightly less in Europe. Like Europe has been able to mitigate that rise, but definitely America, China, India is growing, inequality is going up. The difference is that China and India are producing high inequality at a time of high economic growth, whereas the Western economies are in a state of slowdown. So this basically, what this suggests is they have reached a maturity period where they have the welfare state to rebalance this if they wish to. Whereas for India and China, the challenge is to redistribute the game. Like, will there be an automatic redistribution or even a pre-distribution of resources to the rest of the population? When you follow a standard capitalist development model, this is the Lewis Kuznets framework, basically, then that model predicts that as your economic growth goes up, the level of inequality goes up. There's urbanization. There's gains from technology. They will go to the people who had the head start. So, this is the reason why China is already ahead of India. It had a head start in adopting their growth model, right? So they had a 10-year head start to India on that front. So these kinds of issues obviously will produce inequality. The question is whether it is producing extreme inequality, which cannot be reversed, or whether this is manageable inequality, which can be reversed. Now, one of the issues in India is that there just aren't enough large cities. This is a real constraint on India, which is that Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, these are the main cities where there are good jobs, there are good service sector jobs. The tier 2 cities are a big step down compared to these cities. So how do you give enough income to that segment of the population without, some kind of overarching model that looks to diffuse growth geographically and across the income distribution? So I think that some inequality is to be expected with a growth process. And India's growth process is, it's very haphazard. Like they, since the 1990s, it's been tumbling and bumbling from one set of one strategic goal to the other. We will privatize, then we will not privatize, then we will privatize. All the economic reforms, those kinds of things have been happening, but it's produced a little bit of growth, 4 or 5% economic growth per person. And that's quite significant. India went from $800 US in the mid 1990s per person to over 2,000, but that's still very less. And that means that we have a long way to go. Will that long way produce a lot of inequality, or will we be able to control it at some stage is, I think, an issue. And remember, we have to do this with democratic constraints, which is that every government has to also keep looking at the lower end and of the population, the poor in the population. They have to do something about them. No government can get away from it, right? Like whether you are BJP or you are Congress, whether you are NDA, UPA, you have to have some kind of pro-people aspect to this. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But like I said, I think the issue is it's probably extreme compared to moderate. Like if I was to put some weight on where we are, the problem is that inequality is extreme. Like the increase in inequality was a little extreme compared to what it could have been. We are still at a point where in the cities, young people who get jobs are able to fully employ another person at 10% of their salary. So people work in people's homes, right? Like this is, of course, issue of class and caste. But people from rural India will come and work for people who don't have skills, who don't have high-end skills, will come and work at your home, and you can afford to pay them a tenth of your salary per month, and that will be okay. You might be able to pay them maybe 10 to 20% of your salary and employ them. So people who are not capitalists, people who are general work people, are still able to afford to employ people full time in their house at a very, very low wage. And so within the household itself, there is kind of a market contract, and that just tells you how much inequality there still is at this point.
Yeah, not just one people, in fact, many people.
Many people, yeah.
Many
yeah,
people.
yeah. And this happens like when people, so young people coming out of colleges get their first job, they're able to do this, which means that, for the highly skilled or the educated, there's a lot of income available because they can then, they're able to get high paying jobs, which then can afford them the services of almost a full family. They can hire a family in some sense to take care of them. And while they
that's a very important point, But let's say there's lots of literature which is coming out saying that the middle class is shrinking because of restructuring of the economy due to technological disruptions. You have the rise of this gig economy. So the old middle class is not disappearing. I think it's more pronounced in America and the advanced economies. But I think even in India, we're seeing some sort of slowing down of socioeconomic mobility. And it has been called techno-feudalism, different kind of thing, What do you think is happening, not just in India, but across the world, if we talk about the middle class in specific?
Yeah, so I think of it in a very simple framework. You can get more economic growth by either getting people to produce more per hour they work, right? So a person, I can increase my productivity and that will increase my output, or I can increase my hours. I can work more and that will also produce some output. And in what's happened with technology, I think, is that it's been able to encroach into, in the Western Hemisphere, definitely what it's done is it's encroached into your working day. So you're done with a low wage job and you have some extra time available. Why don't you drive Uber, and then you're basically marketizing your leisure time and making money from that. With India, the issue is slightly different. Firstly, in India, most of the labor force, is in the informal sector. It has precarious work conditions. But the issue that's happening in most of the global south, the middle to lower middle income countries and poor countries, is that the industrialization pattern has gone through this premature deindustrialization, which is that instead of going from the unorganized agriculture sector to organized manufacturing, or even organized services, we think that India is a service sector economy. The problem in countries like India is that we have this transition from unorganized agriculture, and the labor is basically flowing there towards unorganized services. People who work outside an office, selling snacks, selling food, barbers on the roadside. So their situation has always been precarious. It doesn't matter whether you bring Uber there or not. Uber is just another precarious option for somebody. It's to an extent a work option. It's at least some opportunity, but still precarious. And the difference between the barber who has to shut his shop, or the snack seller actually outside an office who has to shut his shop on the weekends and not make any money because there's no office functioning on the weekend. And the Uber driver is that one has an app and the other probably is doing something physically. But otherwise, the conditions are precarious for the lower end. It's a very, very, the fundamental challenge of all societies is to elevate the living standards of everyone at the same time. Now, if there was a perfect solution to this, then people would hire experts to get this. But we have to kind of bumble our way through this democratically.
But coming to the solution, right? So in India, we have more experts than the solutions. In fact, the solutions in India do not work. The experience of 70 years tells us very clearly. But what now? What is the way forward? What are the solutions? Let's say, what are the not solutions, but policy options? We have to pull lots of people out of poverty. We want higher economic growth rate. How to tackle inequality given these objectives?
Well, there's one fairly brutal long-term perspective, which is that it takes 100 years or more than 100 years for an economy to truly develop to a sufficient point. We can be dispassionate about it and just say that India really became independent by the mid 20th century, and it will take us all the way till the end of the 21st century to show any. This is a very mathematical, brutal way of thinking about it. 3 or 4% growth per person over 150 years will definitely increase everyone's living standards to an extent. Now, whether that growth can be sustained over that long term is the challenge. But that's one way of thinking about it. That we are at a very early stage in the historical lens. This is a very early stage of development. The market has only started functioning since the 1980s, and its efficiency is still questionable. But can we sustain growth for 150 years, 100 years consistently at 4%, 5%? That will automatically pull up everyone to a great extent. And this is like I said, this is a very dispassionate mathematical. Like if you just plug in the per capita income and you calculate growth at 3 or 4%, then India will be at a fairly reasonable standard by 2070 or 2100. But we don't have the patience to, look that far into the future. And the challenge in front of the government is very stark. We are at a very low level of income. Do you really increase taxes across the population when most people don't have enough to live? So a small fraction of the economy pays taxes. But even most of these people also do not make exceptionally high incomes. In these cities, they are just about on the 80th percentile, 90th percentile. So redistribution is a very major challenge. And historically, redistribution has been a challenge, but Western economies either had the advantage or disadvantage of having resets through the world wars or, those kinds of major sustained events, which led them to completely unite in terms of one strategic plan to go through post-war reconstruction and kind of socialize the gains of economic progress. That's not something that anyone in India wants. And India's challenges are obviously well known. Like India is already poor. It has hostilities in the neighborhood. There's the challenge of international relations today in terms of trade. There's the challenge of globalization, which is not proceeding the way it was the last 30 years. So obviously globalization has come under a lot of scrutiny now, right? So I guess I would say I don't know. And I don't want to forecast the future because I think forecasts are very unreliable and things change too fast. But at this point, the only thing I can say is that it may be about sustaining growth in the long run. And, 200 years down the line, maybe the gains of prosperity will diffuse across the population. And then we may think, why were we making a big deal why were these people on this podcast making such a big deal about this in the year 2021? They should have dealt with the pandemic and should have stayed quiet about and sat it out. But I just don't know. There's no formula, I think, to get this. And we have to figure this out as a democratic setup.
I think that's the most honest answer anyone from the economics has given to any policy challenge, that I don't know. That's also very pessimistic because it's very brutal that we still have a long way to go. So this triumphalism which we see in India every now and then is literally unwarranted. And I keep saying, I've never seen any Chinese politician talking about China becoming a world power. Unlike every mohalla level politician in India talks about India being power.
Yeah, you at $2,000 or $3,000 of income, you cannot you're well below the average income of the world. Or less than half the average income of the world. So at this point, the challenges are they're not to become a superpower, but they are basically to sustain economic growth for some period of time, and maybe in 2100 we can revisit the superpower challenge.
Maybe 2100. China is what America is today, and India is what China is today. Maybe. But thanks a lot, Rishabh, for your time. A very interesting discussion. I don't think we are having enough discussion on inequality in India. For some reason, that's almost absent in the policy and the public discussion. But thanks a lot for refocusing the attention on this very important topic.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much again.
And thank you, audience, for listening to us. Please subscribe to the channel. See you soon.